Welcome everybody. It's 1:30 and it's great to see you. If we haven't met before, my name is Sharon Dirckx. I'm a speaker, author, podcaster, mostly in the area of Christian apologetics. I also speak and preach in my local church. And we have the pleasure, I should probably stand behind the microphone, of thinking about the question of science and wonder and apologetics this lunchtime. So if you were thinking you're supposed to be in a different seminar, now is your moment to make your break for freedom. But what we will look at today is science, wonder and apologetics. It's quite interesting to ask a scientist to speak on wonder, because I'm very wordy and wonder is bigger than words. But hopefully we can enter into some wonder as we think about this as well. And I was fascinated to see that in just last month, an article was published in the Times about our new Pope Leo's comments on some of the observations from this James Webb telescope, showing that the insight into creation that it gives us brings us a mysterious joy. I thought that was really interesting. And he said this, in our own day, do not the James Webb images also fill us with wonder and indeed a mysterious joy as we contemplate their sublime beauty? Very interesting to have, this kind of fusion of exactly what we're talking about today, scientific discovery with wonder. And so I am not a cosmologist, so I don't terribly know what a lot of these images mean, but these are some of the images that we are seeing from this telescope, which was launched on Christmas Day in 2021. It orbits the sun at a fixed distance, 1 million miles from Earth. It has been able to detect galaxies that, if we accept the science, for more than 3.5 billion years ago, and only 290 million years after the universe was born, at the singularity that Stephen was referring to. And, let's just throw this in. The article by Kaya Burgess says it has also detected hints of possible alien life in the atmospheres of distant planets. And so here are some of they're just kind of beautiful in their own right. Planetary nebula. I don't know what they are. I feel like I should, but they're extraordinary. It's extraordinary that things like this are now observable in our universe. And so, I want to think in this session about how does science and awe and wonder work together, and how can we harness, hi, welcome, join us. No worries. How can we harness this apologetically as well? And by that I mean in giving reasons, in being ready to talk to people, in having conversations, in pointing people to God. Some resources that I found helpful in preparing this is a really helpful book by Ruth Bancevich, who's based in Cambridge at the Faraday Institute. She wrote it 10 years ago, so in a way ahead of the curve in thinking about science and wonder. It's called God in the Lab. And she's got chapters on the use of imagination, beauty, wonder and awe in science. And I really encourage you to get hold of that, and if you're interested in this. And also has a subsequent book looking at wonders of the living world from a scientific perspective, a lot of images and details in there. Found also The Territories of Human Reason by Alistair McGrath to be very helpful. And of course the book that lots of people are talking about that was held up this morning, Have You Ever Wondered, is a way of thinking about this question more broadly. There are a number of scientific ways into apologetic conversations highlighted in that book as well, through things like maths and the moment of creation and so on. But I want to start by, in a typical scientific fashion, trying to define wonder. maybe it defies definition. But what is wonder, and how does it differ from awe? Well, we are in Cambridge, so I looked up the Cambridge dictionary rather than the Oxford English Dictionary. And there it says, a feeling of great surprise and admiration caused by seeing or experiencing something that is strange and new, that is wonder. And then awe, a feeling of great respect, sometimes mixed with fear or surprise. People often use wonder and awe interchangeably, but are they the same thing? Should they be used interchangeably? Ruth is very helpful on this. She defines them differently, and we'll start with awe. She says this: awe is the mixture of overwhelmment, wonder, and fear that we feel when we come across things that are larger, more beautiful, more powerful, or complex than anything we see in our everyday lives. To be awestruck is one of the most basic human experiences. The night sky, vast landscapes, of the mighty forces of wind and sea are accessible to almost every person on earth and can affect us deeply. Architecture, paintings, and music often move us in a similar way. Awe invokes feelings of reverence or respect. There's also the need for mental adjustment and accommodation. Before we can take it in, we need to make room in our mental map of the world for this new and amazing thing. I think that does quite a good job of capturing something of what awe is. And then wonder, she says, is a stepping stone on the way to awe. Wonder on its own, what you might call childlike wonder, is what we experience when we're confronted by anything new or unexpected. Wonder is an active and hopeful feeling because we have the opportunity to learn when we come up against the unfamiliar. We are amazed and surprised, and it makes us curious. We want to examine and understand it. We might begin to doubt what we thought we knew about it and enjoy the process of asking questions and beginning to untangle its mysteries. And there may also be an element of mental adjustment as we try to make sense of it. Overall, to wonder is a pleasant experience because the object of our attention is fascinating but not threatening. So in her view, but there are different views, wonder precedes awe. Wonder is the initial engagement with the newness, and awe is that settled feeling that comes later as you digest it and try to kind of accommodate what you're feeling or seeing. So in a talk on awe, I thought I would just look at some other awe-inspiring discoveries. The DNA in the human body. Are there any geneticists here? No. I used to be a biochemist a long time ago. The human genome contains around 6 billion base pairs of DNA per cell. And that, if you stretch it all out, takes up 2 meters. There's 2 meters of DNA in every cell in your body. The reason it's not 2 meters long right now is because it's being tightly wound up. But there are 50 trillion cells in the human body, meaning that there are 100 trillion meters of DNA in every human body. That's 100 trillion. And the sun is only 150 billion meters from Earth. So there's actually enough DNA in every human body, if you stretch it out end to end, to travel to the sun and back over 300 times. Let's just let that settle in for a minute. Is that not awe-inspiring? Or at least cause us to wonder? I see you taking photos of it. I'm going to move on though. Chemical reactions in a single cell. Of all of those 50 trillion cells, this is just one. This is one cell. So as a biochemist, I love this diagram. I'm sure it's even developed since then. This is a diagram of every chemical reaction from the late 1990s of everything that's going on in a single cell in the human body. And all of these chemical reactions have very particular enzymes that are catalysts that are necessary for those reactions. Those are proteins that have a very, very specific structure. Isn't it fascinating? I found it really interesting what Andrew Peterson said this morning about biological life, that the closer in you zoom, the more fascinating it becomes. There's a single cell. And so there are, let's see, in one cell, 10 million chemical reactions per second. And there are 50 trillion cells in the human body, which means it's so big I had to look at what is the word for this. There are 50,000 quadrillion reactions per second in any human body. So if you want to know if you're busy, yes, you are very busy every second of the day. Now, that got me thinking about the resurrection. You know, about that moment when Jesus was raised to life, that second that changed history, that moment. There were 50,000 quadrillion reactions taking place. 1 minute, nothing. Next minute, 50,000 quadrillion. Does that not fill you with wonder and awe? Well, there's the beauty in mathematics. We could take so many different things, but there's this sequence of numbers that were first described in India, but were given prominence by Leonardo Fibonacci. Each new number is the sum of the preceding ones, the preceding two numbers. And it's useful in maths and computing, but it also appears in nature. Describing the arrangement of petals on flowers, spirals on seeds and on pine cones, the branching of trees. What does that tell us? I thought, again, it was fascinating to hear Stephen say this morning that even if quantum cosmology is to be taken seriously, what precedes it is maths. Is maths to be created or is it to be discovered? This seems to be further evidence it's to be discovered. It already exists. It's our job to uncover it and discover it. And then there's the deep sea. And there's creatures like this. I don't know if you've seen, I mean, to be filled with awe and wonder, watch anything from David Attenborough, right? And I remember watching the clip of this delightful creature called I don't know, perhaps unfairly named, the sea devil anglerfish. He's just doing his thing, you know. The bottom of the sea, lives in the most inhospitable part of the planet, at the pitch black sea bed where there is no light. No longer than about 30 centimetres most of the time. It has this interesting dorsal spine, which is luminous, and it has this little bit of fleshy thing at the end of it, which looks like food to a passing fish. And so it can lure prey in, and then suddenly they get swallowed up by the sea devil anglerfish. And the mouth and the body of this fish are so malleable, they can swallow prey up to twice its size. But the most fascinating fact I discovered was that females are significantly larger than males, and only they have the dorsal spine. And the males, once they find a female, because it's so flipping dark at the bottom of the ocean, they just cling on. They found a mate, they're just going to cling on with their sharp teeth, and eventually they become fused, physically fused with the female, connecting to her skin and bloodstream, and they lose their eyes and all their internal organs except the testes, so they can still reproduce. And a female will carry 6 or more males on her body throughout her lifetime. Talk about feminism in nature. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that, a bit controversial. At the very least, it fills us with a sense of awe. May not be pleasant, but it's awesome. That just, yeah, while we go about our lives, the sea devil anglerfish is hanging about at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. So, a brief history of wonder. And again, these are very broad brushstrokes. Is that the fire alarm? Okay. All right. Shall I'll carry on. If anyone can smell smoke, let me know. I think I don't want to spend too long on this, but if we start with ancient Greece, we have, throughout history, it's a mixed picture, but from the ancient world, wonder was seen in a very positive way. People like Aristotle and Plato would see it as the beginning of knowledge, the basis of learning. Plato has even said that this feeling of wonder shows that you are a philosopher. So if you wonder, you are a philosopher, because wonder is the only beginning of philosophy. Wonder is the only beginning of philosophy. And actually in the Middle Ages, Augustine and Aquinas very much adopted this classical view, but only redirecting it towards God. That when you wonder, this leads ultimately to greater understanding and knowledge of God. And in both cases so far, wonder is intellectual and emotional. It's not simply a feeling. It has an intellectual undercurrent as well. In the Enlightenment, we see a mixed picture. We've already heard about Isaac Newton, who combined his scientific rigor with a sense of awe at the cosmos. But then you also have materialists such as Baron de Holbach, who saw awe and wonder as something that cloud our reason and need to be removed altogether from the scientific community. But then you've also, in the same, proximate era, got people like James Clerk Maxwell of this university, almost certainly known for having the words of Psalm 111 inscribed above the original Cavendish laboratory. Great are the works of the Lord, for they are pondered by all who delight in them. This idea that science is undergirded by pondering and delight, not as a detraction, who's an extremely effective physicist, but that pondering and delight are central for the scientist. And then you've got Romanticism, where there's an attempt to reclaim some of the loss of wonder that in the Enlightenment period, where reason was emphasized more heavily. And then the 20th century was a very mixed picture. Again, I can't remember if I have any quotes here. No. 20th century, very mixed picture, because on one level you've got Einstein, who said the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. He to whom the emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. That's from Einstein. But then you've also got the emergence of logical positivism, which led to scientism and materialism, in order to understand something, you just need to break it down into its most basic components. Only things that can be measured empirically have meaning. Well, that doesn't leave too much room for wonder. So it was a mixed picture. And I think in the 21st century, as we find our way through it, there's a re-emergence again of the need to recapture a sense of wonder and in the sciences. Now, let me ask you, who here is a scientist? Who is So a decent number of us. Would you say you've experienced wonder in your work? Yeah? What sort of, anyone want to share how you've experienced that? No?
Partly just in seeing something new, discovering something. When I worked in electron microscopy and just, you're sometimes looking at things no one had looked at before. And there's a beauty in the images as well, but there's a beauty in the discovery and seeing something new. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And there's a sense in which, and different areas of scientific research enable wonder to different extents. I have a PhD in brain imaging. There was a long, and actually did that here. out at Dirckx. There were times in my PhD that if anyone dared ask me what I was doing, I was like, just don't ask me. I don't want to talk to you about it. Oh, it's like mostly fiddling around with Excel spreadsheets and yes, quite interesting technology using functional MRI to study the human brain. But in reality, that is mostly kind of data crunching and looking at blobs on brains. And yeah, anyway, so it was a mixed bag. But actually, when wonder does, a lot of the day-to-day for a scientist is fairly mundane, but when moments of wonder come, that can help us to keep motivated. I actually had a dream about my one of the sets of results that actually were in my PhD thesis. Before I collected the data, I had a dream about them. And they weren't particularly world-changing results, but I did dream about them, so it's an interesting thing. So science leads to wonder. The things that we discover cause us to wonder. And of course, Christians don't have the monopoly on this. Dawkins, in Unweaving the Rainbow, says that the feeling of old wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. It is a deep aesthetic position to rank with the finest that music and poetry can deliver. That is truly one of the things that makes life worth living. So science leads to wonder, but also, wonder leads to science as well. You will know probably already that Newton, the way that he discovered, he was actually, that during the plague of London was had gone to the countryside and was sitting in the grounds of a particular manor and ended up watching an apple fall from a tree. And he wondered, why do apples fall straight down? Could the force pulling the apple down be the same force that governs the moon and the planets? And of course, this led eventually to his laws of motion and universal gravitation, published in his Principia. So a scientific discovery that began with a single moment of curiosity and wonder. So wonder also leads to science. Maybe he was thinking, why on earth am I needing to kind of be based out here? I want to be back in the heart of things. And yet it was in that moment of potential boredom and wondering that he had a breakthrough. And so how can we harness science and wonder apologetically? How can we harness these things? Well, many people, I don't know if you find this, many people around us are not necessarily interested in spiritual things, but they are interested in science and its discoveries, and they are open to wonder, and they do experience awe. And so we can actually harness it in these by taking the things that they are interested in and starting there and building a bridge to spiritual conversations. Let me explain a bit more about what I mean. Alistair McGrath says that there are different kinds of wonder. There is immediate wonder. There's the immediate impact without the need to reflect or absorb. And then there's derived wonder, the wonder that comes from further scientific exploration, where you actually find something fascinating and then you do further studies and you find even more that's fascinating. And then there's spiritual wonder. He says that there's wonder that asks what the phenomenon points to. What does it actually point to? And perhaps to think about this a little bit more. C.S. Lewis has, in one of his books, writing on something called a meditation in a tool shed. And he says, if you imagine a light beam coming through some slats of wood into a tool shed, there are a number of different ways that we can make sense of that light beam coming through. We can look at the beam, we can just accept the phenomenon for what it is, or we can look through the beam to analyze its components. Or we can look along the beam to its source, which ultimately takes us to the sun. And that's a little bit what this approach is getting at. What does the fact that nature causes us to wonder tell us? Where does that point us? And ultimately, in our minds, we're thinking that our wonder at nature actually points to the wondrous maker, ultimately. And I guess because we're looking at natural phenomenon in the natural world, we're kind of engaging in natural theology along the way, which is, we've had both of these verses already today, that actually when we look at nature, it is telling us something about God. That in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. And therefore, in looking at nature, we're going to be learning things about God. And the fact that nature causes us to wonder and experience wonder and awe, that points us to an awesome, wondrous God as well. And again, Romans 1 verse 20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, engaging in natural theology, we need a cautionary note that actually our ability to read nature in a perfect way is not possible for a number of different reasons. Our study of nature is necessarily flawed. We can perceive the divine to some extent, but not necessarily in a complete sense. There have been errors of the past in trying to see nature as some sort of conclusive proof of God. And of course, in seeing nature as divine. And both of those actually are not necessarily helpful in this approach. And the Genesis 1, in fact, is written, the author's intent is to show that God has created the natural world, but remains distinct from it. Now, Ruth Bantovich is very helpful in explaining why our ability to perceive God in nature is flawed. Firstly, creation is not God, so it doesn't fully reveal his character or purposes. For that we need Jesus. Secondly, as creation is not God, it is not to be worshipped or idolized in itself. Third, we are not perfect, so we need to be aware that we might deceive ourselves and say things about God's character that might be false. And finally, creation is described as groaning. The world that we live in is not perfect and will only reveal God's character fully when it is renewed at the end of time, as described in Revelation 21. So those are just a few disclaimers about the engagement in our perception of the divine and what we can derive about God from nature. But even so, even with all of that said, we can still channel and harness natural theology in how we are thinking about awe and wonder in science. And I want to sort of highlight two approaches and just look at a couple of examples of each. And in this part, there will be a bit of repetition of some of the content from the morning, and perhaps I'll spend more time on the content that wasn't covered this morning as well, and make sure that I leave plenty of time for questions. So, two approaches. Firstly, that the discoveries of science, they're not necessarily proof of God, but they make a whole lot more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. The discoveries of science fit much more naturally into a God-centered universe than a godless one. And secondly, science raises questions that science can't answer. And for these, we need to look beyond science to philosophy and theology. And so the scientific discovery points beyond itself to something greater and more wondrous. So let's first of all look at this first one about how we can harness some of the discoveries of science to ask, if you like, some have you ever wondered questions, a bit like Andy and Gavin's book. So here's the first question, which will be familiar to you. On the origins of the universe, have you ever wondered why the universe came into existence statistically against the odds? And again, we're now looking at the cosmological fine-tuning, which we've already talked about quite a lot today. And so just to highlight the extreme unlikeliness of all these constants of the universe coming together simultaneously, Hugh Ross, a cosmologist, sorry about the lack of capital letters in there. I don't get on very well with PowerPoint sometimes. It sets me a template and then I don't know. I'm a bit of a technophobe. I need to, yeah. Anyway, never mind that. He says this: cover America with coins in a column reaching to the moon. That is about 380,000 kilometers away. Then do the same again for 1 billion other continents of the same size. Paint one coin red and put it somewhere in one of the billion piles. Blindfold a friend and ask her to pick it out. The odds are about 1 in 10 to the 40 that she will. And that 1 in 10 to the 40 is the likelihood of all of these constants of the universe coalescing at the same time to give rise to the Big Bang. That is how unlikely we're talking. We're not just talking, it needs to be tweaked a bit. It's so unlikely that it calls for an explanation. And of course, you know, people offer alternative explanations to the God hypothesis. Some say, look, it is just chance or accident. Others would hypothesize a multiverse, that there are actually an infinite number of universes, and ours happens to be the one in which all of those constants coalesced. And others would posit God. I'm quite a fan of Glenn Scrivener's approach to the chance accident, where choose your virgin birth, is what he says. The virgin birth of the cosmos or the virgin birth of the God at the centre of it. Now, we're not saying that this is proof of the existence of God, but we are saying that if God exists, observations like this from cosmology make a whole lot more sense than if he doesn't. And as Freeman Dyson, the British-American theoretical physicist, said, I conclude from the existence of these accidents of physics and astronomy that the universe is an unexpectedly hospitable place for living creatures to make their home in. Being a scientist trained in the habits of thought and language of the 20th century rather than the 18th, I do not claim that the architecture of the universe proves the existence of God. I claim only that the architecture of the universe is consistent with the hypothesis that mind plays an essential role in its functioning. Second phenomenon, quantum physics. Have you ever wondered why even science argues that reality is more complex than we first thought? You know, as Christians trying to engage with people, we are trying to say to them, there's more to this life. But even scientists are discovering this. You know, there's been such an emphasis on materialism, but it turns out quantum physics, we don't even know what matter is. You know, we're trying to explain the whole of life in terms of physics and chemistry, but physics and chemistry are far from straightforward. And Ian McGilchrist, someone that I've been in conversation with in the past, is a psychiatrist and philosopher. he makes this very interesting comment. He says that matter evanesces or passes out of sight as we look at it more closely, and it turns out to be every bit as inscrutable as consciousness itself. And he's responding to the idea that people have tried to explain consciousness in terms of the physical processes in the brain. But he says this: the atom has the curious property that while from a distance it has a blurry self-consistency, it does not become clearer but more indistinct as you zoom in, so that there is less and less to see until it evades your grasp entirely, and its nature changes by the mere fact of being observed. All this is fine, but it renders impossible the role in which materialists wish to cast matter, the solid, mind-independent basis of mind. Here's a question. If atomic reality is more complex than we initially thought, perhaps that is true of reality as a whole. I was really struck by a comment by Tom Wright in his description of sin. Sin is being seriously wrong about the nature of reality. I thought it was fascinating. So, have you ever wondered why even science argues that reality is more complex than we first thought? Asking wondering questions. And then let's move to our second category, which is saying that science raises questions that science can't answer. And that is why we need other disciplines like theology and philosophy. That doesn't mean those questions aren't important, but just that the sciences can't answer them. Questions like, have you ever wondered why science is possible at all? That's not a scientific question, that's a philosophical question. How is it that we can even do science? And what would be needed for science to be successful? Well, a couple of things, several things, but I'll simplify it. Firstly, the regularity of nature, certainly on the macro scale. If you set up a study here in Cambridge and you go and repeat it in Oxford and you keep everything the same, what should you find? Same results. It's something that's so fundamental to the repeatability and testability of hypotheses and theories, we don't even think about it. But it implies there's an orderliness to the natural world that undergirds it. Now, where does this come from? And where does it come from, particularly in the light of the materialist explanation that it's blind, unguided, disordered forces of nature? But of course, as we've already heard, many of the prominent scientists in the modern scientific revolution were theists who believed there was order in nature because they believed in an orderer behind it. C.S. Lewis in Miracle said that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. The order undergirding the natural world that makes scientific hypotheses repeatable and testable, in a way makes more sense if there's an orderer behind it. Now, the second thing that is needed for science is that we have minds that can make sense of the world. We have cognitive reliability. This is an area that I've thought about quite a lot. I have a book called Am I Just My Brain? And the answer is no. You also have a mind. So when you mean mind, don't use the word brain because they're two very different things. You can read a bit more about that in my book if you would like. But as human beings, we have an ability to make sense of the world around us, and we can think logically. There's a coherence between our minds and our ability to uncover things about the world. Where does this come from? And where does it come from, especially in the light of the view of some materialists that we're nothing but a pack of neurons? Your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You're nothing but a pack of neurons. The problem with this view, that was Francis Crick, by the way, co-discoverer of the DNA double helix with James Watson. Problem with this view is, how can non-conscious neurons produce conscious minds? That is not a done deal. That is not resolved. That is not a recent idea. It's been discussed since the ancient world. It has not been thrown into the light by the rise of neuroscience or brain imaging. Our neurons are not themselves conscious. So how is it that somehow they coalesce if it all entirely resides in the brain? And what is the most persuasive explanation for what it is, why we find ourselves as conscious beings? Because there is something that it is to be you. And measuring your brain doesn't access what it is like to be you. Could say a lot more about that. What's the most persuasive big picture reason for why we happen to find ourselves here as conscious thinking beings? If God doesn't exist, we live in a non-conscious universe. And somehow conscious humans have popped into existence. And that's not impossible, but it's surprising. It's quite unnatural. However, if God does exist, we didn't start with matter. We started with a conscious being in a conscious community of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And through the Trinity, all things were made. And therefore, actually, the existence of conscious humans is much more natural to theism, and it is extremely unnatural to materialism. So these are all ways that we can engage with natural theology in trying to ask kind of wondering questions. Have you ever wondered why we can even think at all? Have you ever wondered why it is that we're conscious, if it's true that we live in a non-conscious universe of time plus matter plus chance and the forces of nature? And this is why people like Richard Swinburne would say, look, I'm not postulating a God of the gaps, a God to merely explain the things that science has not yet explained. I'm postulating God to explain why science explains. God is the reason why it works in the first place. And Stephen Meyer mentioned a quote from John Polkinghorne, and that is it. I'm not going to read it out in the interests of time. I'm going to move on to another question. Have you ever wondered why we are drawn to the idea of significance and purpose, even though it contradicts the scientific narrative? Because if God doesn't exist, we are scientifically incredibly insignificant. We sit here, if we accept the scientific narrative, we sit here on a spinning mass of rock, metal and water that is 4.5 billion years old in a cosmos 14 billion years old. Homo sapiens have been around for 200,000 years. And if we think of the time since Earth formed till today as a 24-hour period, humans have arrived at 23, 59 and 59 seconds. So compared to the overarching narrative, we are a speck on the cosmological landscape. And that's the whole human race as one. And if we take one human life, even less so. Lawrence Krauss said that we now know that we are more insignificant than we ever imagined. If you get rid of everything we see, the universe is essentially the same. Whether we're here or not makes no difference. We constitute a 1% bit of pollution in a universe. We are completely irrelevant. And once we do get our chance on this planet, Dirckx says that we are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. Flowers are for the same thing as everything else in the living kingdoms, for spreading copy me programs written in DNA language. That is exactly what we are for. We are machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every object's sole reason for living. Bit of a wonder killer, actually, in that very statement. And so, why is it that so many people think their lives do have significance if that contradicts the scientific narrative? How do we marry these two things? There's an area of conflict, I tell you. Could it be that there's another narrative that actually is needed to sit alongside, that there's not just the scientific narrative, but other narratives as well. You could look at people like Viktor Frankl that say living with a sense of purpose is connected to resilience. He was a Holocaust survivor and described that those who were living for something bigger than themselves had a greater likelihood of surviving in concentration camps. Those who have a why can bear with almost any how. We are drawn to the notion that our lives are significant. On one events week, I gave a talk on this title, What Was I Made For? Really well attended. What was I made for? Which turned out to be the theme song for the Barbie movie. That was deliberate, it wasn't accidental. And some very interesting lyrics from Billie Eilish. I used to float, now I just fall down. I used to know, but I'm not sure now. What was I made for? What was I made for? Taking a drive, I was an ideal, looked so alive. Turns out I'm not real, just something you paid for. What was I made for? So if the scientific narrative carries such authority, why does it contradict my intuitive sense that my life has meaning and significance? Could it be that there are other narratives that sit alongside this narrative? You'll remember the 50th anniversary of the moon landings in 2019, and probably you'll know that one of the astronauts, Buzz Aldrin, was a Christian who took communion before he disembarked after Neil Armstrong. On the way back to Earth, he asked for a moment of quiet at NASA. And during that descent back to Earth, he read some words from Psalm 8. He said, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings, that you care for them. You've made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honour. And it must have been extraordinary for him being confronted with the vastness of space. And when we think about that, and when we look at the pictures from the James Webb Telescope, even though they're very awe-inspiring, it's easy to feel very insignificant. But actually, if God exists, we have a different story to tell that sits alongside all of these other things, that says every life is important, and in a way that is disproportionate to the scientific account. Final question to think about before we think about briefly how we can cultivate wonder and then questions. Have you ever wondered why science can't tell us if this life is all that there is? You know, there are those that, some people still may believe science can answer all of life's questions. Not the question of what happens when you die. Science and medicine has succeeded in delaying death and preventing early death. Transhumanists have implants and biotechnology that can make our bodies stronger, that can overcome some weaknesses. Cryogenics have enabled some bodies to be frozen in the hope that one day they'll be revived. But science so far has not been able to reverse death or peak beyond the death barrier. And yet some people have a sense that they're made for more than this life. So where does that come from? And what does this life look like? You know, Ecclesiastes tells us that God has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the human heart, not just people that believe he exists, but every human heart. And C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. That in Jesus, the death barrier has already been defeated. A physical upgrade is already possible. Tell that to the transhumanists. There is a world beyond this one, yet connected to this one, that is open to everyone. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. So have you ever wondered why science can't tell us if this life is all that there is? These are just some examples of wondering questions, questions that might be a gateway to a conversation that causes us, that cause our friends, our colleagues, our family members to wonder, to pause, to wonder, to think about what they believe and how much it actually makes sense of the world, and whether there are other frameworks or worldviews that should be tested and considered. So very briefly as we finish, how can we cultivate wonder in ourselves and encourage it in others? I think essential to cultivating wonder is to slow down and pay attention. Wondering requires looking deeply and noticing. Really hard to miss things today when you're doing this. Part of my story that I share in Am I Just My Brain is that around the age of 10, I was really bored looking out of a window on a rainy day. I was in the northeast of England. And suddenly the thought bubbled to the surface of my consciousness. Why do I exist? Why can I think? Why am I a conscious, living, breathing human being? And I think it was out of boredom that came, perhaps similarly for John Newton watching apples drop from a tree. Do we have moments like this in our digital age when we're constantly occupied and every spare moment is spent checking our social media feed or emails or WhatsApp? But to cultivate wonder, we need to slow down and pay attention and notice. Secondly, to foster curiosity, asking questions and encouraging them in others. Children are known for their curiosity. I was just in the loo, there were 2 small children, a dozen questions already to the poor mother. And they can be known, 2 to 5-year-olds can ask between 75 and 300 questions a day. Perhaps you remember that in your own life. Good scientists are curious people who are open to new ideas, who are open to noticing things that they may not have seen. It's often in noticing those things that breakthrough comes. And it can lead to wonder. Thirdly, embrace humility. Implicit in wonder is an acknowledgement that there is something greater than ourselves, even if we wouldn't call it God. That actually implicit in wonder is recognizing there are limits to what we can comprehend. Not that wonder is irrational, but it is beyond rational, which is possibly why the Enlightenment period saw a dip in the appreciation of wonder. And then finally, leave room. In trying to overly pin down God and a phenomena, we lose something. In a sense, wonder, when we're in a kind of engaging with mystery, engaging with things that have some words but also can't be captured by words, some would say that is actually taking us closer to what God is like. So allowing for those kind of moments. And taking that kind of attitude. How can we cultivate wonder? It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We've got about 6 minutes for questions. We can probably take a couple more if you need to. But would you like to ask a question? I'll go with you first. Yeah.
Thank you very much, in particular, for the quote about choose your virgin birth. I think that resonates with quite a lot we heard this morning as well. And I just wonder if you thought a little bit about kind of plausibility because whichever kind of whether you choose and to look up the sky and describe it as the heavens and it's wonderful, or it's space and it's not, well, those are both kind of plausible, kind of workable mind views. Either it is, either you do see the wonder or you don't see the wonder. So anything yes. on plausibility. But the other thing I'd just like to just question, because I'm mindful in all of these talks where, to some degree, we're a self-selecting audience who would buy into the propositions that the speakers are making. And what about those people who have a different disposition and may not be thinking so plausibly about wonder and awe, but maybe kind of fear might be something.
Yeah.
The same point I made this morning.
Yes.
So I'm interested to know if
yes.
you've done any thinking about the nature of fear,
yes.
as well as the nature of wonder.
Yes.
And you end up with a different narrative, because
yes.
your starting point is fear.
Yes.
And we can look at climate change and
yes.
the prospect of the plains being flooded at 4 degrees
yes.
in heat
yeah.
in our own lifetime.
Yeah.
With the destruction.
Yeah.
We may not end up in a position of
yeah.
wonder, but rather in fear.
Yes.
So, and then what do we do with that? So,
yes.
So just two ideas, one about
yeah.
fear instead of awe,
yes.
and the other about kind of plausibility and bias, I suppose.
Yes.
There's a plausible story which lands with her own life experience.
Yes.
And therefore we choose one of those routes rather
yes.
than the other.
Yeah, so to your first question, I would want to say we assume that we come to the data of the universe neutrally, but we don't come to it neutrally. In fact, I think C.S. Lewis has a piece on the obstinacy of belief, and people hold the beliefs they do for all kinds of reasons, not simply the kind of rationally coherent basis for whatever phenomena that we're looking at. And actually, very often people hold their beliefs on an emotional basis, often a deeply irrational basis, but often that isn't articulated and may go very deep. And may often be totally unrelated to their scientific position as well. And so and that's why that this is always meant to be one of a number of different tools that the apologist has in their belt, that actually we need to be thinking about other things as well. And so we're not going to come to things neutrally. And, Romans talks about the impact of the fall on the human mind, that it both bears the image of God, but also the brokenness of the fall, and which means that we can't always view the evidence for what it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to be seen. We can't see it, and when we talk about, just not being able to perceive it. And that's why, well, firstly, anyone coming to Christ is an absolute miracle, and it actually requires a change of mind as well as a change of heart, and the impact of the Holy Spirit on the human mind. If you've been close to someone that's come to Christ and actually seen the difference that makes, that actually they see the world differently, don't they? And so there is an impact of the fall on all of this, which is why I put those disclaimers about natural theology in there, that we're not able to perceive nature perfectly because of our fallenness. And in your second question, I heard you ask the question this morning, and it made me think. So the closest I haven't done anything on fear, but what I have done, spent quite a lot of time on evil. I have a book on natural disasters called Broken Planet. I don't have a copy with me. I don't know if it's in the bookstore, but again, I think we need a theology of nature which accepts both its beauty and its brokenness. Every natural disaster is both a combination of human factors and natural factors. There's no such thing as a 100% natural disaster. So even famine, although it is kind of the land itself not yielding its crops, it's obviously driven politically, and there's it's the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, South Sudan right now. And that's not a natural thing, that's a human thing. And so I think we have to have a distinction between human evil and moral evil, coming from how people behave, and natural evil, how we make sense of the way the world is. But I think our encounters with suffering can be a very, actually, something that comes up a lot. People are often more open to God, actually, because of their experiences of fear. I'm actually doing some work on the supernatural at the moment and how people have actually, you know, when they experience darkness, they realise there's more, more to this world. And that's where the attractiveness of Jesus comes into that in a very powerful way. So I think similar to what Andrew was saying this morning, fear can also be, you know, God can use that as much as he can use beauty. But I think we need a proper theology of suffering and of creation being both beautiful and broken at the same time. Thank you for your question. There was one here and then Andrew, yeah. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Regarding your question, how can non-conscious neurons produce a conscious mind?
Yeah.
What about emergent phenomena? I mean, you can have like, how can non-wet dihydrogen oxide molecules produce wetness?
Yeah.
And also,
Yeah.
where can we observe minds without neurons or some other, if AGI or something like that, a material substrate of some kind?
Yeah.
We reliably observe minds without some kind of material substrate. And also, when some material substrate is arranged in a particular way, say neurally, in particular energy states, minds reliably show up. I mean, doesn't this indicate like a one-to-one relationship between a neural network and mind?
So, thank you for your question. All the science shows us is that mind and brain are connected. So just to be clear, because I didn't spend long on it, by brain I mean the physical substance inside your skull. By mind I mean your thoughts and emotions and memories. There's something that it is to be you. And how do those two things relate? Now, the science shows us that they're connected. So in my job in brain imaging, you put someone in a brain functional MRI scanner, and you give them a task that uses their working memory, like you're trying to memorize a shopping list and say it back to yourself. You're engaging your working memory. So that's an aspect of your mind. And when you analyze the data, you see networks in the brain light up. So yes, mind and brain are clearly connected, but that's as far as the science goes. If you want to start saying that the brain generates the mind, you've moved out of what the science can tell you into philosophy. There's no scientific study that you can do that will tell you that brain generates mind. And added to that, you have the biochemical problem. You described the wetness of water, but you're still in the fundamental area of chemistry. You haven't moved into the realm of biology. And this is an area that actually scientists are thinking about more and more in terms of abiogenesis, you know, right at the beginnings of the origins of biological life. How did physics give rise to, how did chemistry give rise to biology? Again, not a done deal, not resolved by any means. Faces the same challenges as the cosmological situation that we were hearing about this morning as well. And so just because you put the word emergent there doesn't change the problem. How do minds emerge, conscious minds emerge from non-conscious neurons or chemicals? It is not a done deal. It's not proven, it's not established. And in fact, it can't be. All the science can tell you is that mind and brain are connected. And actually your assumptions about a kind of AI and a kind of, again, your philosophical position is going to influence the starting hypotheses that you're working from. And you're starting from a materialist position that assumes something that the science can't tell you. It's a philosophical position that you're holding that is actually one of a number of positions that people hold on this view. You will find people that say that, well, some people will say that brain generates mind, but not in a, you get Christian theists holding this position, but for them, the system is not a closed cause and effect one. It's one in which God exists and there's information in the system. So you've got more hope of crossing the chasm from non-conscious neurons to conscious minds. And then you've got substance dualists that say mind is a non-physical substance, brain is a physical substance, and these two are very closely connected. And then you've got panpsychists that say everything is conscious, has kind of conscious properties woven into the physical, and that's how they make sense of it. And these are all kind of empirically neutral. There's no one that kind of can be argued over the others based on the science.
So we never have to worry about minds, synthetic minds ever being a possibility, or about, say, non-human animals?
It depends what you mean by mind. Obviously, we're seeing AI incredibly growing exponentially in its capacity to kind of replicate human consciousness. But that is not the same thing as saying it is a conscious being that has a sense of self. So John Searle, philosopher, has a thought experiment called the Chinese room, where he says, imagine someone inside a room being passed Chinese messages, closed room, being passed Chinese messages from someone outside. The person inside doesn't speak Chinese. All they have is a code book. And so they receive the message coming in, they interpret it through the book, and they figure out a response, and they send it out. To the person outside, it seems like the person inside speaks Chinese, but they don't. All they can do is process Chinese characters. And that's what we're facing. Even now that we're talking about large language models and things like ChatGPT and so on, we're seeing data crunching that has the appearance of consciousness. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is conscious. It's simply crunching massive data sets and coming out with a human-sounding response. So I think one of our bigger challenges will not be that there will be conscious minds, but that we will need to discern between what is conscious and human and what is artificially appearing to be conscious. So yeah, and I think one of the bigger challenges will be in the human regulation of AI rather than conscious androids or algorithms. Thank you for your question. Andrew, do you still want to ask yours? It's gone. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.